A lie repeated 1,000 times ultimately becomes a truth. Now, these are the key words and key assumptions on which even today the media industry flourishes. Welcome to an episode on a lecture session of world media scenario after World War II. In today's lecture, we will have three parts. How did the media evolve after Second World War? It was a key moment in our history, especially in the history of media. And then we had Cold War. And after that, the evolution or emergence of the third world nations which got the independence from their previous colonizing powers. And then we had for a short spell the non-aligned nations. If you are wondering that with my first statement that a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes a truth, it is almost like a biblical word. It's almost like a commandment of the media industry, and you will be surprised to know that these golden words were spoken by a person whom we consider to be one of the enemies of humankind. These words were spoken by Joseph Goebbels, the information and broadcasting minister of Adolf Hitler. Now, it's very interesting to note that why do we consider media, of course, we take it for granted that media is primarily information, knowledge, and of course, entertainment. But how does it relate itself to the superpowers, the world wars, and everything? We will be surprised to know that starting from Hollywood, Bollywood, television industry, radio, print, they have taken immense leaps in their profit in getting very powerful for the causes of war, for the causes of political and international tensions between nations and continents. Yes, this is the harsh reality that we have, and since we are dealing in media and we are trying to excavate and we are trying to interpret, decipher a lot of meanings of media industry and how to read media and its behavior in the world. These are the things that we have to consider, and to our surprise, the history of violence of the world is interlinked with the flourishing industry of media. Now, one thing is very important. We always take it for granted that knowledge is equal to power. Not really. When knowledge prompts us to take certain actions, it becomes power. Now, you might have a lot of knowledge, but you might sit in the corner of your room and do nothing. That will not make you powerful. If you have the knowledge and if you are implementing it in terms of your actions, then you become powerful. In the case of media, especially after Second World War, these were becoming very important facts, and the people who controlled and manipulated news, information, print, newspapers, films, radio, television, they knew it very well. The first thing that comes to our mind after Second World War is the Cold War. Now, if we just to have a little light on what is Cold War, the Second World War, after the defeat of the huge Nazi power, the world was divided into two halves, almost into two halves. One is the capitalist Western countries, for example, Great Britain, United States, France, the Western Bloc, which is popularly known as the Western Bloc, and the other half with the Soviet Union, where the ideological impetus was communism, Marxism, and socialism. Well, it's very interesting that we gained independence. Our nation, India, we gained independence in 1947 when the Cold War was taking shape and Second World War was just finished. And it's very interesting to note that India followed both the ideologies in terms of its political economy, in terms of its planning, in terms of its values. Now, we took in our constitution, we took the socialist aspect of Soviet Union, which was a very successful economic plan, and we also took some of the features of United States, which has which has a lot of amount of capitalism in it. The Cold War means this war was fought between the two value systems, and this war never fought on face to face. There were no battles, there were no tanks, there were no deaths. Of course, deaths were there, but always almost the deaths were there, not on the battlefields, but espionage and spies, and in that world often we don't know about them, and on which James Bond and a lot of espionage films were based on. Now, Cold War is a battle of values. On one hand, you have the free market, you have the people, the individual, the capitalist system, and on the other you have the community, the communism, Marxism, and a kind of a socialist take on the world. It's very interesting that when you have a battle waged on values, on human values, these are very, very important values, because if you have a piece of chocolate, it's as simple as that. If you have a piece of chocolate and you are sitting with your friends and you know that the chocolate is quite expensive and it is meant for you, what would you do? Would you store it? Would you hide it from your friends? Or you will have it all alone? It depends. It depends on how you want to have your chocolate, sharing with your friends or having it on your own. These are the very basic value systems that we grow up since our childhood. Antonio Gramsci, very popular Marxist historian, philosopher, he said that media actually hegemonizes, or in other words, brainwashes the common people. Hegemony is a kind of a brainwash that you are not aware of. It's almost like what was there in the history of various nations based on racism, based on gender politics, based on gender bias. And now we have evolved and we have got rid of those hegemonized conditions. Hegemony is something that you are under that spell and you don't know what. Media exactly does that. And it will be a little error to say that media has stopped these kinds of hegemonies. We still have a lot of products which tell you to use in order to get fairer and get out of your racial quote-unquote blackness. So we are still under the spell of hegemony, of course, thanks to media. But in a broader aspect, what Antonio Gramsci said was that media is controlled by powers, power, authority, and media control means controlling the minds of the audience. Especially, you will always find that it's a very commonsensical notion that if you have one king, you have minimum thousands and thousands of followers. So the followers, each and every follower acts according to the king. It's a kind of a truth that we have been facing since the inception of human civilization, and in the same way media is dictated by a few powers, few authorities, and it has its influence on millions and millions of people. So when you are showing something in media in terms of political values, in terms of consumption, in terms of religion, in terms of whatever, you are actually giving or disseminating an information to thousands and millions of people what is right and what is wrong. And not, if not all, but majority of people fall under that trap. It might be good, whatever the information is given by the media might be good, might be bad, but we are not always in a position to judge that. This was exactly done by the two superpowers during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the other allied countries which followed Soviet Union, which followed the ideas of communism, and at the same time a more powerful dictatorship on media was represented by the Western or the capitalist countries, United States, Canada, France, Spain, and West Germany, of course, Great Britain also. Now, media does something, it preaches a kind of a value system for its domestic and for its international audience, and tries to create the monopoly of a single value system. Now you can go to any of the websites. Of course, most of the websites are not there to increase your knowledge and make you powerful. The websites are there to sell something to you in terms of knowledge and gain some kind of transactional value. So we always have to keep this thing in mind. Media, apart from values, also is a brilliant business venture. Let's talk about media and hegemony of United States after Second World War, especially during the Cold War. Now, it might be said that the United States media is almost their project in television, in print, in cinema was to sell capitalism, to sell the American dream, which is based on capitalism. United States after Second World War, they tried or they poised to become one of the or the most important and powerful nations in the world. And this was the same aspirations were there by the Soviets. The Soviet Union, they also tried to manipulate media, just like the United States did, through various forms, and they wanted to dominate the cultural value system of the world, both the blocks. And the third world countries were in the middle. We never, countries like India, we never knew to which idea we should align. We were taking values, whatever was best in from both the camps. Now, a very important aspect for United States using media was that United States had their history of the Great Depression and the First World War and Second World War, especially First World War and the Great Depression, where the economic crisis was at its peak. So what United States and their foreign policy thought was, if their values of capitalism and consumerization were spread all over the world, it will not only give them an advantage of preaching to the people that they are right, their value system is right, but also, just like the colonial powers, they might expand their market, and expansion of market means expansion of their business. The question of American dream was pivotal to the value system of United States, and this was preached through various forms of media. Well, when you are preaching a kind of a value system, you have to create an enemy. And this was very strategic for the United States propaganda and the capitalist propaganda. So they invented a kind of an enemy. Of course, this enemy, no wonder, was communism. Now, very interestingly, even these kinds of systems of propaganda were there more in children's books, in film posters, in maps, in magazines, where entertainment and media were mixed. Now you can see certain images of cards, of bubblegum cards, where American capitalism was hailed and the binary was put communism as an evil. You can also see a lot of films which were made by Hollywood and by United States, like I'll just you can see the posters. One of the names was The Red Menace, and or Is Stalin Alive, The Girl in the Kremlin, or Runaway Daughter, or I Married a Communist. So these were hugely successful films, at the same time not for their aesthetic values but for their political propaganda. Now you can also see that this trend in Cold War battle through media propaganda continued even in the 80s and the early 90s. You can see that the poster that we can see right now is that of Rambo 2 and Rambo 3, where Vietnam and Afghanistan was in question. And there were some subtle films which put the Russians or communism in an evil way. For example, Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump is a very popular film, but yet it was not beyond the propaganda model. And of course, we have already mentioned James Bond films, like From Russia with Love. Now, talking about children, talking about graphic novels, superheroes, we have a very popular comic story of Superman where the name is, you can see the poster, the name is the Red Sun, and you have another Superman from Russia with the symbols of communism. Now, very interestingly, television was also a very strategic part. Television was more domesticated in nature, and United States started teaching what is the very basic value or what are the advantages of capitalism from the grandmother to the little children, because of television was a domestic model. Even in newspapers, even on maps, you could see that the Russian maps, the political maps, were painted as red, and there were a lot of danger signs attached to it. There were often advertisements, like you can see on the screen, like where the caption is, "I don't want my children to grow up in Soviet Russia," or "I learned about communism the hard way." So these were very blatant and very important but straight on the face propaganda used by United States in our daily lives. You don't have to go to a debate in order to get these political notions, but there's these propaganda models were there in bubblegum cards, in your everyday superhero comic books, in your newspaper advertisements, everything. So hating or hatred towards communism was a part and parcel of life, which contributed to the dreaming of the American dream. But at the same time, we have just focused on United States, but we also have the counterpart of the Russians. The Russians, most of the they stressed heavily on prints more than films, on prints. And you can see that there's a very, very aesthetic poster of Soviet Union where a worker is pasting poster written Lenin. You have very beautiful and very artistic, creative posters you can see on the screen. There are certain posters which are very symbolic in nature. One of these posters, it shows that the youth will answer to capitalism. There's a picture in red, the picture of a little child. And there's another poster where you can see that there is a missile or a submarine hidden under the United States flag. So these are very creative and very subtle at the same time. But something changed the equation, and something changed the power structure. Near the end of the 80s, capitalist Western Bloc became very powerful, and the values of Soviet Union were eroding away. A very interesting work. A lot of books are now available on this. This is a case study which gave almost a decisive blow to this Cold War. The battle of media was the Radio-Free Europe, or a kind of a radio which was there in each and every household of the communist Soviet Union, but it was giving some authentic and at the same time some propagandist news and views of the Eastern Bloc or the communist countries. Now you can see there are two posters, two advertisements of Radio Free Europe. In one of the posters, it shows that a little child behind barbed wires, and it says, "Don't let her grow up without hearing the truth." Now you can broadcast your ideas on truth and freedom behind the Iron Curtain over Radio Free Europe. So a very strategic media penetration of the Western world into the communist worlds, where the darker sides of the communist regime was upheld to the people residing in communist countries. This was it's a huge decisive blow for the communist regimes, for the people. And suddenly, near the end of the 80s decade, we could hear that Mr. Gorbachev, the last president of Soviet Union, is deciding to divide the country, and we can finally see that in Cold War, the battle is lost by the communist Soviet Russia. And with that, the country was divided into more than 10 countries, and Berlin Wall was broken. There was no East Berlin, there was only one Berlin, and there was no East Germany, there was only West Germany. And soon after that, we could see that there was this new economic policy of globalization was coming, free market, free economy. But just before that, we can see, we could witness through media, through a lot of things, that communism was dying. With that, we come to the end of the first talk of our show. Hope you have a lot of questions. We will definitely answer them. Thank you.